Ken Torino. I'm Manager of Community Partnerships and Resource Development at Historic New England. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Kate Clifford Larson with us tonight. For those of you who are new to Historic New England, I want to just give you a word of who we are. Historic New England is the largest regional heritage organization in all of America. We own 38 properties, which include landscapes and have a magnificent library and archives. If you're not familiar with us, I urge you to go to our website, historicnewengland.org, and check us out. We are gearing up to be opening more of our properties this summer. We also offer a full slate of programs, and as part of Women's History Month, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Kate Clifford Larson. Before I do that, I should just mention that there is a way to get transcripts depending on what kind of Zoom you have. At the bottom of your screen, it might say live transcript, and that's one way to get it closed captioned. And the other thing I want to say is we do want your questions. So if you have questions, I urge you to put them in the Q&A. I will be monitoring that throughout the program and then come back at the end. We expect to finish up around 6, but we do want your questions. So with that, let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Larson is a New York Times and Wall Street Journal best-selling author of 3 critically acclaimed biographies: Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman, Portrait of an American Hero, which we're going to be hearing about tonight, Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy Daughter, and The Assassin's Accomplice, Mary Surratt and the Plot to Kill Abraham Lincoln. She's consulted on feature film scripts, most recently, as you might guess, the Harriet, starring Cynthia Erivo, but she's also consulted on documentaries and museum exhibitions, animation, and augmented reality productions, public history initiatives, and numerous publications. Her award-winning consulting work includes Maryland's Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad home, wait, so I'm getting these mixed up. Oh yes, Underground Railroad State and National Historic Park, the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Byway, and the All-American Road and the Harriet Tubman Home and National Park in Auburn, New York. Dr. Larson is interviewed by many national and local media outlets, has appeared on national and international television broadcasts, including the BBC, PBS, and C-SPAN. She is currently writing a biography of civil rights icon Fannie Lou Hamer entitled Walk With Me, and that's due out this year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Larson.
Thank you, Ken. It's really good to be here, and hello, everybody. So Women's History Month, following Black History Month, this is just a great time of year to reflect on the powerful work that African Americans have contributed to this country, including my hero, Harriet Tubman. So tonight I'm going to tell you a little bit about her life. It's going to be a broad sweep of her life and her amazing work, and talk a little bit about the friendship she created here in the Boston area in New England. And then I'll finish up with just talking about why is she so important, and what is it about her that makes her worthy of being on our $20 bill. So we'll get to that in the end, but this is a brief overview of her life. So, and by the way, this photograph on this first slide is a photograph that was discovered like 3 or 4 years ago and sold at an auction house at Swan Galleries in New York City. It was in a photo album that had photographs from the 1860s, but because of this photograph that had never been seen before, the album sold for $160,000. So she's about 44 years old in this photograph in Auburn, New York. So Harriet Tubman was born on the eastern shore of Maryland in Dorchester County. And this is where all of her life, early life, was spent in Dorchester County, and then a few years before she escaped in 1849, she lived in Caroline County, but this is where she was born and raised, enslaved. And the landscapes of the Eastern Shore, many of them in Dorchester County, have not changed at all since she was there, but it's forests. There are a lot of rivers and streams, creeks and marshes, agricultural fields. And I also put this picture here of a very old church that was built after she left Dorchester County, but it was built by the community that helped raise her as an enslaved child. So these are the landscapes that she knew and lived in. This is where she grew up. And on those landscapes, she became educated by her parents and other people in the community. She could not read or write formally, but she did have great literacy because she could read those landscapes and knew how to survive on those landscapes. And that came in very handy later in her life when she started working on the Underground Railroad and rescuing people. We have a lot of documentation, as it turns out, about Harriet Tubman's life and her family. Because they were enslaved, they were property. And in the South, property was recorded and it was taxed and it was passed down from one generation to the next. So when I started my research, I went to courthouses and I checked into archives to research the estates and probate records for families that enslaved her. And this is actually part of a probate record for a family by the name of Anthony Thompson. And he enslaved Harriet Tubman's father, Ben. He did not enslave Rit, his wife, or all of their children, because Rit was enslaved by Anthony Thompson's stepson, Edward Brodess. And because of inheritance patterns and things like that, they were separate families. But in this document, after Anthony Thompson died, he enslaved 43 people, and his estate listed them all by family. And the first name on the list is Ben, and it notes that his wife and children belonged to Edward Brodess. And when Anthony Thompson died, he put in his will that Ben would be set free and given 10 acres of land to live on. And for people who are interested in archaeology, the state of Maryland is conducting an archaeological dig at the site of the Thompson plantation in hopes of finding Ben's cabin and his 10 acres. And they're starting that next month. So I'm really excited. I hope they find some remnants of the slave quarters there. But this is the type of documentation that you find in Southern archives if you do this kind of research. And this is a photograph of Anthony Thompson's house. He was considered one of the wealthiest men in Dorchester County at the time. This is like a fairly good-sized federal-style colonial home. This is not Tara. This is not one of those huge plantation homes. It's just a home you might see here in a New England town. When Tubman was born in March of 1822, and she had 4 brothers and 4 sisters. She was the 5th child. And when she was born, her enslaver, Edward Brodess, was about to become an adult. And in the following year, he was 21 years old, and he wanted to leave his stepfather's home. So he took his enslaved property, Rit and all of Rit's children with him, to his own inherited property in Bucktown, Maryland, which was about 10 miles away from the Thompson plantation. And this began a terrible period in Harriet's family. Their last name was Ross. The Ross family was separated from Ben, who was back on this other plantation. And in Bucktown, Edward Brodess he had a small little farm. He was not a prosperous man. He was a bit of a jerk, to be honest with you. And he used his enslaved people as cash. He sold 3 of Tubman's sisters to earn money for himself. So he tore the family apart from Ben first, and then he sold 3 of her sisters, which devastated the family. And this is a part of slavery that isn't talked about enough, the separating of families from each other. And they would auction off babies away from their mothers, and siblings apart, and husbands and wives and mothers and children. It's just horrible. So this happened to Tubman, and it scarred her family deeply. There were slave traders from the Deep South in the 1820s and 1830s who came and bought many, many enslaved people and brought them down to Alabama and Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. They could double or triple their price by bringing them down there to clear land for cotton and sugar and other agricultural products. So it was a huge business. This is an advertisement for Dempsey P. Kane. He was from Mississippi, and he ended up purchasing one of Harriet Tubman's sisters. And we don't know what happened to her. Her name was Mariah Riddy, and that was the first sale of a sister away. I have a picture here too of the Bucktown Village store, and this plays a role in a very significant event in Tubman's life as a young girl. You can visit this store today in Bucktown, Maryland. It is a historic site. So when she was 13 years old, she had been hired away, leased to a neighboring farmer in Bucktown. This was very common in the Upper South. People who had enslaved people in their possession, if they had too many of them, they would lease them to other farmers or other people, and they would earn income from them. So he leased Harriet Tubman as a young girl to a neighboring farmer. And she tells this amazing story that she's out in the barnyard at this temporary master's home, and she's breaking flax in the yard. And she talked about, she's 13 years old and she has very bushy hair, and it was very greasy because she used to wipe her hands and her hair after she ate to kind of tame her hair down. Well, as she's breaking flax in this barnyard, bits of dust and flax whip up into the air and they settled into her hair. Well, as this happened, the plantation cook came to her and said, you know, you need to come with me. Her name was Minty at the time. Minty, you need to come with me to the dry goods store. I need things for the kitchen to cook. And 13-year-old Minty didn't want to go because her hair was messy. But the cook was insistent, so Minty grabbed a shawl from the kitchen and wrapped her hair in the shawl. And she said that her hair and the shawl saved her life that day. Because when she approached the Bucktown store, there was an altercation happening. An overseer or a manager from a field was chasing an enslaved man who had left his assignment in the field. And the overseer had chased him into this store. And the overseer yelled to Minty, stop the man, you know, stop him. But Minty didn't. She stepped out of the doorway and let the man run out the door. Minty stepped back into the doorway as the overseer picked up a weight from one of the scales on the dry goods store counter and threw it to hit the man. But because Minty had stepped into the doorway, it slammed right into her skull and cracked it open. She collapsed unconscious on the floor. They brought her back to the plantation, laid her out on the seat of the loom, you know, like a long wooden bench, and just left her there. A day later, the plantation owner came in and demanded she be woken up and sent back into the field, and they did that. And she described in lectures how the blood and the sweat would stream down her head until she collapsed in the field because of the head injury. And it took her mother months and months to bring her back and have her heal. It's remarkable that she did, in fact, heal, but she did. It left her with what we believe to be temporal lobe epilepsy. She experienced seizures for the rest of her life as a result of this head injury. And she would have a seizure would come upon her at any time when she was working or talking or doing anything. And she would collapse onto the ground, but she was aware of what was going on around her. She just couldn't talk. And sometimes she would have tremendous visionary activity, or she would hear music, or she would hear people talking. Often she felt that God was talking to her when she'd have these seizures. She'd hear water rushing, or sometimes she would feel fire burning her or people screaming. So there was a lot going on during these seizures. But she became incredibly, incredibly spiritual. She became a devout evangelical Christian at that time. And so she could not get treatment for the epilepsy, but she incorporated what was happening to her into this unknown world and this spirituality. And she found comfort in believing that God was speaking to her when she had seizures. And so I often say, I'm not going to argue with her because she trusted in what she heard and it helped her survive. Some of these photographs here I'm showing you are from the film Harriet that came out a year and a half ago. So she healed, and she's still a teenager, and Edward Brodess leased her to the Stewart family in Madison in Dorchester County, which was a maritime community. It was on Madison Bay, and the Stewarts were merchants. They were very, very successful businessmen, and they owned ships and wharves. So she worked for them. First, she worked in their house and did a lot of domestic work, but she preferred to be outside. One thing, a lot of enslaved women did not like to work in the house. It left them vulnerable to men in the house, and it also was an endless work day. They could be called in the middle of the night to do things and then work all day. So, but eventually she convinced them to let her work in their fields. They had agricultural fields too. She got stronger and stronger, and then she started working on the docks, which was fortuitous for her because she was very strong, even though she was 5 feet tall. This is where she connected with Black maritime workers, stevedores, the Black seamen called blackjacks, ship carpenters, and they were part of a vast network, sort of an underground communication network in the Black world, in the African American community. They could carry messages back and forth from, you know, disconnected communities in the Chesapeake to New England and beyond. So she learned about those communication networks, and she heard about freedom in the North, and she heard about the safe places to go and the places that were not safe to go. So this was a crucial educational time for her. I've also put here a picture of a runaway advertisement. Levin Wolford advertised for the capture of his enslaved woman, Nellie Keene, who was pregnant, and she already had 8 children. It's so curious because he wasn't even sure how many children she had. That's how careless he was. Anyway, she escaped in 1832 with her husband, and the really exciting thing is he sailed them away. There were a lot of Black maritime enslaved people as well. Joe sailed them away in a little sail canoe, and I believe that they must have sailed through the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, which had just opened a couple of years before that. To make a long story short, I discovered some of the family members in Salem, Massachusetts in the late 1840s. I know that they were never caught, so obviously they made it as far as New England, which is really exciting. While she was working in Madison and getting stronger and stronger, and this is in the 1830s, she was also closer to where her father lived, where she had been born, in that large enslaved community. There was also a large free Black community that lived in that area near the Thompson plantation and Madison, where she was working. And she met John Tubman, who was a free Black man who born of free parents. Half the Black population in Dorchester County at that time was free. And so they married. She was not forced to marry him. They were in love and they got married. The great tragedy is if they had any children, they would belong to Edward Brodess. They would not be free children because the laws were that children born to an enslaved woman were enslaved and belonged to the man that owned the enslaved woman. But they were in love and they married about 1844, and that's when she changed her name from Minty Ross to Harriet Tubman. We believe she took Harriet in honor of her mother. Her mother's name was Rit or Harriet. So they lived together near Madison and near the Thompson plantation. She worked out a deal with Edward Brodess. She paid him $60 a year and to be able to lease herself. And then she could hire herself to anybody that she wanted to. Well, she was such an amazing worker and an entrepreneur. She saved enough money to purchase 2 oxen, and that increased her productivity so she could earn even more money. And she and John were hoping, obviously, to buy her freedom. But Edward Brodess died in 1849, and he left behind a wife and 8 children, and he was deeply in debt at the time. So Eliza, knew that she needed to sell some of the enslaved people in order to pay the debt so she could keep her tiny little farm. When Tubman heard this, she and two of her brothers decided that they would try to escape to freedom. So on September 17th, 1849, she and her brothers, Ben and Henry, fled and tried to escape. This was an advertisement that was discovered in 2001. A man who lives in Dorchester County was walking by one of the stately homes on Cambridge, which is the main town in Dorchester County. It's the county seat, and there's a main street called High Street, and this was one of the large federal-style homes was there, and it was being sold out of the family for the first time in more than 200 years. And the descendants didn't want anything in the house, so they had pulled up dumpsters and were heaving things out of the windows in the attic into these dumpsters. And my friend saw this, and he started dumpster diving and found lots of things, including copies of newspapers from the county from the early 1800s through 1900. And in that group was the newspaper with Harriet Tubman's runaway advertisement. And it was only a reward for $100 for each. For Minty, she was still called Minty by her enslaver, Eliza Ann Brodess, her brother Ben, and Harry or Henry. And you can see by the description here, Minty, this is 1849, she's 27 years old. She's described with chestnut color, fine looking, about 5 feet high. So she was petite, a petite person. So Minty, Harriet Tubman, and her brother stayed away for 2 or 3 weeks. They became confused about which way to go, and they were frightened. So her brothers convinced her to go back, and they did. But Tubman knew that she was going to be sold, and she felt that that was a death sentence. In fact, for enslaved people sold from the Upper South, sometimes it was a death sentence. The average lifespan was 7 years once they arrived in Mississippi or Louisiana. So she thought she would take the risk. So one night, she left the plantation in neighboring Caroline County where she was working, and she had met a Quaker woman nearby in the county who had said if she needed help to please come to her, and Tubman did. She approached the woman told her to sweep the front yard so she wouldn't draw attention. And then that night, the woman's husband came home, put Tubman in a wagon, and took her to the next station on the Underground Railroad. There was an Underground Railroad network on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. There were several Underground Railroad networks on the Eastern Shore of Maryland at the time. And this one was particularly active coming out of the western part of the Eastern Shore, the eastern part of the Eastern Shore counties. So she followed the directions all the way until she reached the border between Delaware and Pennsylvania. And she describes this moment where she arrives and the sun rises and it shines down on her, and she looks at her hands, and they're free hands, and she felt like gold was shining all over everything. Then her heart was broken when she got to Philadelphia. She realized that freedom had its limitations because everyone she loved was still back in Maryland and enslaved. And that's when she decided that she would go back and rescue the people she loved. So she started her rescue missions a year later in 1850. And over the next 10 years, she returned 13 times and rescued 70 or so family and friends, and gave instructions to about 70 more who found their way to freedom following her instructions. And how did she do it? I'll tell you, she did not use the quilt code. She did not use lawn jockey as a signal, and she didn't sing Follow the Drinking Gourd. Those are all myths. They're all made up. They never happened. No one ever used any of those things on the Underground Railroad. The North Star was very important to Harriet Tubman, and she said she followed the North Star. And of course, she could do that because she grew up in a maritime community. That was one of her literacies. She could read the night sky. So she knew the constellations, and she knew how to follow the North Star. So once she started her networking, she collected or tapped into an amazing array of Underground Railroad operatives and routes out of the South into Pennsylvania, New Jersey, the New England states, New York, into Canada. There were dozens and dozens of people that were part of these networks. And it is remarkable that she met some of the most famous, the most important abolitionists of the time. This formerly enslaved I don't want to say illiterate because she had many literacies, but she could not read or write. And she tapped into this group of people that were just astounded when they met her, that she was willing to keep going back and rescuing people. Some of the networks, an important part of her networks were people still in Maryland. And it was the most dangerous place to be an Underground Railroad agent, because if you were an African American and you were an agent, if you were caught, you could be killed or sold into slavery. You would lose your freedom. There were enslaved people who were part of the Underground Railroad network in Maryland. They chose to stay behind because they didn't want to leave family, or they had circumstances that they could survive, and they helped promote freedom for other people. So it was an amazing network in Maryland and very secretive. The maritime community in Baltimore, for instance, was very important. Market women were famous for their role in the Underground Railroad, passing messages back and forth, and also fake passes so that people could leave, because you had to have a pass if you were African American to travel anywhere. And this other photograph is a picture of Samuel Green, who was a Black minister, a free Black minister in Dorchester County, and he helped at least 25 people escape. And Harriet Tubman used him several times as an agent for her rescue missions. In Philadelphia, there was a tremendous network of Underground Railroad operatives, including William Still here on the right-hand side of the screen. He ran the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee office in the city. He had a large committee of supporters who raised money, who sheltered freedom seekers who made it to the city. He kept a journal and recorded the names of people that came through his office, and it's one of the best documents about the Underground Railroad that we have in this country. And this is actually a page from his journal, Harriet Tubman coming through his office on December 29th, 1854. She had finally been able to rescue 3 of her brothers at Christmas time in 1854, and William Still wrote about them arriving at his office, and he recorded the names that they decided to take in freedom. They changed their name from Ross to Stewart. And this photograph here is a picture of Tubman's brother, William Henry Stewart. Another great Underground Railroad agent was Sidney Howard Gay in New York City. He ran the Vigilance Committee office there, and he was an amazing abolitionist. And in his journal, he wrote 5 pages on Harriet Tubman, and he called her Captain Harriet Tubman. He was so impressed with what she was doing and who she was. Everyone she met was so impressed and inspired by her and the things that she was doing. And she was so tiny and so petite, and they marveled at her skill in escaping detection by slave catchers. These are just more of the people that were part of her network. In New York, Frederick Douglass, of course, William Henry Seward, who ended up being Lincoln's Secretary of State. He was one of the connections. His wife, Frances, was very close to Tubman. Gerrit Smith, who was one of the wealthiest men in the country at the time, he was very close to Tubman, and he helped her. Stephen Myers in Albany. And then, of course, Lucretia Mott. Tubman said that Lucretia Mott was the first white woman that helped her in Philadelphia. And Lucretia Mott's sister, Martha Coffin Wright, lived in Auburn, New York, down the street from the Sewards. There were many people. Anna Murray Douglass, Frederick Douglass's wife, was part of the Underground Railroad network, and Susan B. Anthony was part of this network. And so Tubman just tapped into all these famous people, and they helped her, and she felt safe, secure, and very well respected by them. In New Bedford, there was a teeming community of Underground Railroad agents and freedom seekers who settled in New Bedford. 30% of Black Marylanders who lived in Massachusetts in the 1850s lived in New Bedford. This is where Frederick Douglass ended up when he arrived in Massachusetts, and eventually he moved to Lynn and then to Rochester, New York. And interestingly, there were several families who had escaped Dorchester County before Harriet Tubman escaped, and they settled in New Bedford. So Tubman had a natural link to that city. And in fact, here was a runaway advertisement for a young woman by the name of Jane Pennington, who Tubman certainly knew from Tobacco Stick, which is now Madison. And she escaped in May of 1854 and ended up with her parents in New Bedford. So it's amazing, these maritime connections and how important they are to the Underground Railroad. Boston. Boston was a magical place. It was an amazing place for abolitionist work and Underground Railroad activities. Lewis Hayden, who was the king of the Underground Railroad in Boston, who lived on Beacon Hill. I hope many of you have been to the African American Historic Site there on Beacon Hill, the Abel Smith School and the historic church. It's a magnificent site, and it's a great legacy of this story of this activist community on Beacon Hill. She was very close to Wendell Phillips and Franklin Sanborn from Concord. He wrote the first biography of Harriet Tubman in 1863. And of course, William Lloyd Garrison. She was very close to Lloyd Garrison. She loved him, loved his wife and his children, and they loved her. They were very, very close. Very close, and they respected her tremendously. And those children maintained a relationship with Tubman until she died in 1913. After the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, it was too dangerous for freedom seekers to stay in cities and towns in the North, so many of them fled to Canada to be safe. And indeed, Tubman brought many of her refugees with her to Canada, and they crossed over the suspension bridge there at Niagara Falls. There is a brand new visitor center there, a historic Underground Railroad visitor center there at the base on the American side of the former suspension bridge that you can visit and hear lots of stories about it. One of the great stories is there's a hotel that was along the Niagara River called the Cataract Hotel, and it had a lot of African-American workers there. 80% of them were from the South in the 1850s. And when Southerners would come up in the summertime for vacation to find cool, beautiful, setting, then they would bring their enslaved people with them. The Black hotel workers would lure the enslaved people away and get them across the river and safety into Canada. And when slave catchers arrived, they would send out a clarion call, and all the workers would leave the hotels and go and find the slave catcher and beat him up or chase him out of town so that he could not capture anybody. St. Catharines was a home for Tubman. She rented a home across the street from the Salem Chapel, which is a historic site in St. Catharines in Canada. And this is also where she met John Brown. He had heard about her great courage and her skills going back and forth into enemy territory and surviving. And so he decided he needed to meet her. So Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists made arrangements for him to meet her in her home in St. Catharines in 1858. And when he arrived at her house and they sat down together, he was so impressed by her, he called her General Tubman and said he was the most of a man. That's how he just viewed her brilliance as that of the brilliance of an army general. And she thought he was the greatest white man that ever lived. He spoke this fiery, biblical kind of condemnation, and he knew that he was the instrument of God to slay the slaveholders and to end slavery. She loved him, and she was going to join his raid at Harper's Ferry, but she did not join him, fortunately. She was in New Bedford or Boston, someplace, when the raid took place. So she did not get captured, and she survived. She joined the Union Army during the Civil War. Massachusetts Governor John Andrew made arrangements for her to go down to South Carolina in January of 1862. And he he knew that her skills as a spy and a scout could be useful to the United States Army. And in fact, they were useful. And she was highly regarded by Union officers and generals. And she did a lot of amazing work. She is considered the first woman to have conducted an armed raid during the Civil War or in any war on United States soil. And she recently, as a side note, was inducted into the United States Army Military Intelligence Hall of Fame in Arizona as a full member. She had been an honorary member, and we approached them and said, we think we have the documentation to prove that she should be a full member. She was actually a spy and a scout. They approved all the documentation, and now she's a full member of the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame, which is really great. So the raid on the Combahee River, for which she gets that honor, it was a raid that she conducted with Colonel James Montgomery of the 2nd South Carolina Colored Volunteers. He was he was a friend of John Brown's. He was kind of a character like Brown. He was fiercely against slavery. And so she worked with him, and they took two steamboats up the river. They routed out rebel forces. They burned down plantations, and they liberated 758 enslaved people. It was an amazing, amazing attack and successful result in freeing all those people. She was very proud of that, very, very proud of it. She also witnessed the Battle of Fort Wagner. She said that she served Colonel Robert Gould Shaw his last meal, the breakfast before the second assault. And she said this about the battle, and I just have to quote it because it's so poetic and it's stunning. She told a professor at Harvard this about the attack, quote, "And then we saw the lightning, and that was the guns. And then we heard the thunder, and that was the big guns. And then we heard the rain falling, and that was the drops of blood falling. And when we came to get in the crops, it was the dead that we reaped." She helped bury the dead and nurse the wounded after the battles. And she also, so working in the hospital, and there's testimony from some of the soldiers that were treated by her, and she was renowned for her nursing skills as well. And she talks about, quote, "I'd go to the hospital, I would, early every morning. I'd get a big chunk of ice and put it in a basin and fill it with water, and I'd take a sponge and begin. First man I'd come to, I'd thrash away the flies, and they'd rise like bees around a hive. Then I'd begin to bathe their wounds, and by the time I bathed off 3 or 4, the fire and heat would have melted the ice and made the water warm, and it would be as red as clear blood. Then I'd go and get more ice, and by the time I got to the next ones, the flies would be round the first ones, black and thick as ever." So vivid. After the war, she returned to Auburn. She had purchased a 7-acre farm from William Henry Seward and his wife Frances Seward in 1859, and her family moved from Canada during the war and settled in the home. So when she arrived there, she had a house full of dependents, and so she went to work right away trying to take care of them and provide for them. And the people in Auburn were incredibly supportive and helped support her as well. There were some amazing stories that have come out in the past few years, people searching in their attics or cleaning out old houses and coming across diaries of people from that time period. And there's one instance of a minister in town who wrote about Tubman would come to the house and she would borrow $5 from him. And then the next week she would come back and return the $5. And he instructed his children that if he wasn't home, that the $5 was always in one of the drawers in his desk, and the children had permission to get the $5 and give it to her every time she came, and also to put it back when she returned it. So there's just these beautiful stories about Tubman. She never wanted a handout. She was going to make a way no matter what to pay people back and also accept the help when she needed it. This is a picture of Tubman by the side of her barn, and next to her, she's on the left-hand side holding a pan. She had just finished feeding the chickens when this photograph was taken. Next to her is her daughter, adopted daughter, Gertie, who was about 13 years old. Her second husband, Nelson Davis, is sitting there next to her. This photograph was taken in about 1887. Her first husband, John Tubman, remarried after Tubman ran away. He didn't want to follow her to the north, and he married another woman, a free Black woman by Caroline. He was murdered in 1867 by a white neighbor. So Tubman later said that she felt free to marry again, and she met a man by the name of Nelson Davis, who was a Civil War veteran, 22 years younger than she was. He had moved to Auburn to work in the factories, and they fell in love and got married in 1869. So they adopted Gertie together. Next to him is a little neighborhood child, Lee Cheney, a boarder, John Alexandra, another little boy that was an orphan that she took in and took care of, Walter Green, another boarder, a woman she took care of, Sarah Parker, and then a great niece, Dora Stewart, is on the end there. There's also a picture here of the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged. Tubman was very, very concerned about the lack of facilities for caring for aged and sick African Americans. Facilities were very segregated, and there were few for people of color. And she wanted to establish a home, which she did in the 1890s. She purchased the 25-acre farm next to her 7-acre farm and was able to establish a rest home and actually a hospital too for African Americans. She was very active in the suffrage movement. She traveled to Boston and Washington, D.C. and cities in New York to attend conventions. Here she's at the founding convention of the National Association of Colored Women in Washington, D.C. in 1896. Queen Victoria heard about her. Tubman had had several biographies published, and someone had sent a copy to Queen Victoria in the 1890s, and she was so impressed by Tubman's story that she sent Tubman a beautiful, beautiful lace shawl that is now at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. She was there, we believe, in May of 1897 at the dedication of the memorial to the Massachusetts 54th there on Beacon Hill. And we know she for sure was there when they had another memorial celebration in May of 1905, because there was a feature story about her in the Boston Herald newspaper. And it talked about how she gave Colonel Shaw his last meal, and she described the war, and she was quite a character, and people followed her while she was visiting and tried to interview her because she was so famous, and people admired her so much. She died on March 10th, 1913 at 91 years old, and she was highly revered at the time. She was very well known when she died. As a matter of fact, the New York Times, their final issue of the year, wrote that she was, well, they had a list of 250 famous people who had died that year, and Harriet Tubman was one of those 250 people. In the 1940s, a Liberty ship was named for her, one of the few for African Americans at the time, and it was launched in South Portland, Maine at the shipyard there. And she never went out of, no one lost memory of her. Her memory was always maintained, at least in the Black community and in some progressive white communities. And people celebrated her in different places around the country, certainly in Maryland and in Boston, as well as in New York, where her home was. And her relatives have been around, and in Canada. But in the 1990s, things started picking up for Tubman. People were paying more attention and wanting her recognized in bigger ways. So the state of Maryland stepped up, and they started creating a byway that's now 126 miles through Dorchester and Caroline counties that takes visitors through the sites of her birth, childhood, adulthood, and her escape routes through the Eastern Shore. And now it extends through Delaware, 90 miles through Delaware, and another 20 or 25 through Pennsylvania into Philadelphia. Our hope is that it will go from Philadelphia through New Jersey into New York, all the way up to Albany and across central New York to Canada in the next 10 years or so. So that would be a remarkable feat. But you can travel this today in your car. And some people walk it, some people take their bikes. It's a great way to learn about Harriet Tubman's life. The state of Maryland created a state park dedicated to her in Dorchester County, and the National Park Service has created 2 national parks in her honor, one in Dorchester County, it's right near the state park, and in Dorchester County, and then there is a national park in Auburn, New York, that is part of her church and her home, and it ties it all together. The really important parts of her life are now National Park Service sites. This is her home today, the property. You can see the backside of her brick house and the barn where I showed you before, the photograph where she stood and had her picture taken. And this is a picture of her church that the National Park Service is currently renovating, and hopefully in the next year or so, people will be able to visit it. So why is this really important to know this history, and why do we tell these stories? Because people don't know enough of this history about slavery. We need to tell the real history of slavery and the pursuit of freedom. We need our children, we need adults to know these stories, because we shouldn't be learning the myth of the lost cause, the story of the Civil War through the eyes of Confederate soldiers it's not appropriate. It's not the real story. And statues to Confederate soldiers, I'm all for them coming down. This one here that I have on the upper left is Nathan Bedford Forrest. He was a murderer. He was a horrible man, Confederate general. There should be no soldiers memorials to him. This one down below is Robert E. Lee. That actually is coming down pretty soon. This is in Richmond, Virginia. Because if we keep telling these stories about the glory and the lost cause myth of the bravery of these Confederate soldiers, they fought to perpetuate slavery. They fought to enslave people. What is there to celebrate about that? We can't have this. This isn't right. It's wrong. And if we had been teaching the real truth in the history all these years, maybe this wouldn't be happening today. We need new interpretation. Like maybe this at the Robert E. Lee Memorial, where an amazing artist projects images of Black heroes onto the monument, which is going to come down. We need more statues to people like Harriet Tubman and other Black heroes and people of color. This one is, the one on the right here is Fern Cunningham's right here in the South End of Boston. So we need more. If we're going to have statues, they might as well be of real people who fought for freedom and equality, not those that fought to subjugate and deny people their rights. We need our children, we need to know the diversity and the great stories of what people did to fight for what we all say we hold dear is liberty and equality and justice and self-determination, freedom. We go around the world preaching freedom and democracy and fighting for freedom. We should be telling those stories and elevating people like Harriet Tubman. Because when children learn her story, they love her story because they can identify her. She was a petite little person. She couldn't read or write. She found ways to make a way, to get ahead, to stand up, to speak out. And they admire her for that. And people are finding so many ways to celebrate her through music, through interpretation at the parks, through signage that kids get together and say, we want to assign to Harriet Tubman here. And they get together and they write about her and they install these signs. And then like in Los Angeles, there was a tunnel boring, these two machines that were tunneling a highway tunnel, and they decided to call them Harriet Tubman. The machines called them Tubman. They were copying the city of Miami that also had a tunnel boring machine that they named Harriet Tubman because it just kept moving on. And I just love it that people are being creative and thinking of different ways of celebrating her life and legacy. And of course, the movie, if you haven't seen it, see it. It isn't historically accurate. It's all right. They did nail Harriet Tubman's personality, her militancy, the love of her family, the importance of her faith and family. And I think it's just a really great, great, fun film. And hopefully she will be on our $20 bill, because what better person to represent those values that we say we hold dear. She's an amazing American patriot. She fought for freedom and equality and justice. That's the face of a person that needs to be on our currency. She fought for freedom, family, faith, and community. She persisted. So I hope that you're convinced, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions if we still have time. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And yes, we do have time. This was, the comments are coming in, informative, engaging, just really wonderful, and give us a lot to think about. And there's some really thoughtful questions, and I'm just gonna jump in with some of those. So George wants to know, how can we help to ensure that Harriet's story is taught in schools?
So make sure whoever develops the curriculums for K through 12 includes the story of Harriet Tubman, and they go to the parks that have the latest research and can help with that interpretation. But you need to go to your school boards and to whoever develops the curriculum to do that.
Great. Someone asked, could you repeat where the shawl that Queen Victoria gave to Harriet Tubman is?
It's at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It's on the Mall in Washington, D.C. It's a magnificent museum, and it is there on display.
Great. So someone asked too about her head injury. Robert wanted to know, do you think that she recovered, or that it was just subdued so that she could function normally?
So, well, clearly the crushed skull healed, but the damage in the brain and on her, you know, it persisted. It caused those seizures for the rest of her life. She did have surgery at Mass General Hospital. I believe it was around 1900. And she said that whatever the surgery was, it relieved the pressure and she didn't get as many headaches after the surgery. So I'm assuming, you know, it was like a head injury. Sometimes you live with that damage for the rest of your life.
So there's another question about her public speaking. Did she lecture much? I mean, a lot of the abolitionists toured Douglass, but there were many that were on the circuit.
So she did a lot of speaking in private gatherings in people's houses, like on Beacon Hill or other places. She did do public speaking though. And when she spoke in Boston at some of the big anti-slavery conventions and rallies and things like that, she was actually introduced as Harriet Garrison to disguise who she was. So, but she did speak in public. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And there were many slave narratives that were written. Even if she wasn't writing, she could have told her story to someone. Do you know, because that was profitable. I mean, Frederick Douglass's book in Britain outsold Alice in Wonderland. I mean,
Right.
Seriously. I mean, these were amazing bestsellers.
Right.
But she never did anything like that.
No, she did. So a woman by the name of Sarah Bradford, who lived near Auburn, was a part-time sort of Victorian author. And she actually sat down with Tubman and recorded Tubman's stories and put it into a little book called Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman. It was published in 1868. And Tubman sold that to raise money to help support her family and to pay her mortgage. Sarah Bradford was not a great person to be taking her testimony because she didn't pay attention, but it is still recorded what some of the things that Tubman said. And Franklin Sanborn sat down with Tubman from Concord, Massachusetts, and wrote up a short biography of Tubman as well. And then it was reissued. The Bradford biography was tweaked and reworked a little bit and republished in the 1880s, and then again in the 1890s. So it was out there enough. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a couple questions about contemporaries. One being, what were her thoughts on President Lincoln?
So she said that at first she didn't like Lincoln and she was mad at him because he would not allow Black soldiers. and he wouldn't set all the slaves free. But of course he did that eventually. And she was invited to the White House and she refused. And then, but Sojourner Truth told her that she should have gone, that Lincoln was a good man, and then Tubman regretted not going to visit him.
Well, that leads into the next question. Did Tubman ever meet Sojourner Truth?
Yes, she did. And actually they met in Boston.
Where did, I'm curious, where did Harriet Tubman stay when she was in Boston?
So she stayed on Beacon Hill, on Phillip Street. There were a couple of places. She stayed with the Haydens, and then she stayed with other people. Later, after the Civil War, some family members moved here, and she stayed with people in the Black community that she knew. And
the National Park Service has some great African-American tours of Beacon Hill, so I'm sure that's probably there.
Right.
Someone was asking about, did she die in poverty? This is from Erica.
So not really. So she always didn't have any money, because every time she got money, she gave it away or used it to take care of somebody else. But when she died, she still owned her home, 7-acre home. And so she was okay. You know, she was not poverty stricken. Her estate was in debt. There's no question about that. But she was okay.
Okay. Few other questions. Where is she buried? This is from Kristen.
She is buried at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn, New York, and it's a beautiful cemetery. It's not a segregated cemetery, which amazes a lot of people who come from the South to visit her grave. And she's buried with a nephew and his wife and her brother, and her husband Nelson Davis is buried a couple of rows over with a nephew and another child.
So Ingrid wants to know about, did her adopted daughter have descendants, and do you know anything about them?
Yeah, so it's really tragic. Gertie did have a baby that died when it was 3 months old in the 1890s. And Gertie had syphilis and she disappeared. So I'm assuming that she died before 1900 because we can't really find her. Yeah.
Great. No, there were lots of questions, but you answered about her first husband, because everyone was kind of wondering how he was out of the picture for a while. But we got there. Oh, where can you get an Underground Railroad map? Can you get that through the Park Service?
So there isn't really a map. There are suggested routes that people traveled, and the National Park Service has a program called the Network to Freedom program, where they are documenting Underground Railroad sites across the country. So the National Park Service Network to Freedom program is the best place to go for information about the Underground Railroad. And that the Harriet Tubman byway, you can go to Dorchester County Tourism, and there's a link to the byway that has maps and information and things like that that you can follow the routes.
And George wanted to know, was there ever a period where slave catchers pursued her?
Yes, and they never caught her. And they didn't. She was just brilliant and smart, and yeah.
Someone asked about, sadly, it was just destroyed, the Harriet Tubman house in Boston. Do you know anything about that? History, was it named?
Right. So the Harriet Tubman house in Boston was established on, I think it was Rutland Street, way back in like 1900, 1905. And so the building that was taken down was built in the 1960s. I don't have the emotional attachment that some people do to it. I don't feel it's such a historic site for Tubman anyway. For the community, yes, obviously, but not for Tubman. And I think that that gets all mixed up together. I think they're two separate issues. But yes, she was part of the dedication of the original Harriet Tubman house back in the early 1900s.
Wow. Well, I think we're going to end there right at 6. I think you've inspired some people. to go on and learn more about Harriet Tubman and to make sure that we don't forget her, we promote her history, because you were so great in giving us a story about what we can do, how we can keep that story alive. So it's now up to us.
Right.
So